There is a civilization the modern world keeps insisting has vanished. The Maya. Say the name and a particular image assembles itself, almost automatically. Lost cities swallowed by jungle, pyramids rising out of the green, a brilliant people who tracked the planets and carved a writing system into stone and then, mysteriously, catastrophically, disappeared. That last word is the lie at the center of everything, because the Maya did not disappear. Some 7 million people speak Mayan languages today across Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras, living on the same land their ancestors farmed thousands of years ago. The collapse you have heard about was real, but it was not an ending, and that is only the first of the comfortable certainties about the Maya that recent science has quietly taken apart. For most of recorded history, the story seemed settled. The Maya were a people of the Mesoamerican lowlands and highlands rooted there since deep antiquity, who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations the Americas ever produced, and then declined in the centuries before the Spanish arrived. A clean arc, rise, flourish, fall. But history, even the kind carved into limestone stelae by the people who lived it, is only the most recent layer pressed over something far older, and when geneticists finally learned to read the layer underneath, the founding story of the Maya turned out to be stranger than anyone had written down. The question was never really whether the Maya survived. They did. The question that the DNA forced open was deeper and more disorienting. Where did they actually come from, and who were the people who became the Maya before there were any Maya at all? The answer did not point where anyone expected it to point. Consider how strange it is that we ever settled on disappearance as the headline. Of all the great civilizations of the ancient world, the Maya are among the few whose direct descendants are not only alive but numerous, speaking related languages, farming familiar land, carrying forward ceremonies and calendars whose roots run back thousands of years. And yet the popular story fixed itself on the abandonment of a few lowland cities in the 9th century and turned that into the erasure of an entire people. The framing tells you something about us, about how badly we want our histories to have clean endings, neat collapses, vanished golden ages we can mourn from a safe distance. The reality is messier and far more alive, and that mismatch between the story we tell and the people who are still here is exactly the kind of crack through which the deeper truth begins to leak. Pull on it, and the whole settled account of Maya origins starts to come loose, until you are left wondering how much of what you knew about them was ever true at all. The disappearance was a myth. The question is what other myths were stacked on top of it, and what the bones beneath the jungle floor would say once someone finally learned how to ask. Start with what everyone believes, because even the foundation turns out to be more fragile than it looks. The conventional picture held that the Maya were essentially local, an in-place development, a civilization that grew slowly and organically out of the populations who had occupied the Yucatan and the Guatemalan highlands since the first peopling of the region. By this account, the line ran straight and unbroken. The earliest hunter-gatherers of Central America were the ancestors of the farmers, who were the ancestors of the city builders, who were the ancestors of the Maya speakers living there today. One continuous thread, deepening in place across thousands of years, with maize agriculture, that defining engine of Mesoamerican civilization, emerging as a homegrown achievement of these same continuous people. It was a tidy story, and it had the great virtue of seeming obvious. The Maya were from the Maya region. Where else would they be from? But there was always a quiet friction underneath it, the kind of detail that nags at specialists long before it reaches the public. The neotropics, the hot, wet rainforests of Central America, are merciless to organic material. Bone dissolves, DNA shreds. For decades, the genetic prehistory of the entire region was almost a blank, a vast gap in the human story, simply because the molecules did not survive the climate. So the in-place story was never really confirmed by hard evidence. It was assumed because it was reasonable, and because there was nothing yet to contradict it. The thread was presumed straight only because no one had been able to follow it back into the dark. And then someone found a way to follow it. There is a particular kind of humility that comes from realizing how much of what we call settled history rests not on evidence but on the simple absence of contradiction. For the Maya, the in-place story endured for generations, not because anyone had traced the genetic line and confirmed it ran unbroken, but because the rainforest had destroyed the very material that could have tested it. The climate itself enforced the assumption. Heat and humidity erased the record, and into that silence we wrote the most intuitive story available, the story of a people who had simply always been there. This is how a great deal of prehistory works. We mistake the limits of our evidence for the shape of the past. We see a straight line where there is only a gap we have not yet learned to see into. And the danger is that the longer such a story stands unchallenged, the more it hardens into something that feels like knowledge rather than the educated guess it always was. The Maya origin story was exactly this kind of hardened guess, waiting, though no one knew it, for a technology that could finally read the unreadable and overturn it in a single stroke. When that technology arrived, it would not gently revise the story, it would invert it, and it would do so using the most degraded, most unlikely scraps of evidence imaginable, fragments of genetic code pulled from bone that had no business surviving at all. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place, 2 rock shelters tucked beneath limestone cliffs in the Maya Mountains of southern Belize, sites called Mayahak Kab Pek and Saki Tsul, where the overhanging stone had sheltered the living and protected the dead for more than 7,000 years. To understand the weight of what was pulled from those shelters, you have to understand how ancient ancestry is read, and why a body buried in a jungle is so close to unreadable. Most ancient DNA degrades into uselessness in the heat. But inside the skull sits the petrous bone, the dense bony shell around the inner ear, the hardest bone in the human body, and it can preserve genetic fragments long after the rest of a skeleton has surrendered to time. From the petrous bones of 20 individuals, spanning roughly 9,600 to 3,700 years ago, a team led by David Reich at Harvard, working with archaeologists Douglas Kennett and Keith Proofer, recovered what they described as the oldest human DNA ever obtained from a tropical rainforest site. And the moment they laid the genomes out in chronological order, the straight thread snapped. The oldest individuals, from before roughly 7,300 years ago, belonged to an early lineage descended from the first migration down from North America, a people only distantly related to today's Maya. Then came a break, and the individuals buried afterward were different, profoundly different. A new ancestry had arrived, and it had not come from the north, it had come from the south. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it inverts the entire mental map most of us carry. The peopling of the Americas is almost always drawn as a single great arrow, sweeping down from Siberia across the land bridge into Alaska, and then southward, ever southward, down through North America, through Mexico, through Central America, and finally into the southern continent, north to south. That is the direction we expect movement to run, and the oldest individuals in the Belize shelters fit that expectation perfectly, descendants of exactly that southward sweep. But the people who arrived afterward had reversed the arrow. They had come up from the south, from the direction of South America, into the heart of Mesoamerica, against the grain of the founding migration. Movement on this continent, it turned out, was never a single tide running one way. It was a sea with currents in every direction, advances and returns, peoples flowing back along paths their distant ancestors had walked the other way thousands of years before. The straight thread was not just broken, it was revealed to have been the wrong shape entirely, a simplification of something that churned and folded back on itself in ways no tidy arrow could capture. The people who became the Maya were standing, without knowing it, at the meeting point of 2 of those currents, the ancient southward tide and a newer northward one running against it. And out of that collision, a civilization would eventually rise. This is the anomaly.